So yeah, so to kind of talk about a little bit more about what we have, the goals and the objective by the end of this class really is to how to test your log line and premise, how to generate when we say outstanding ideas, as I talked a little bit about the notion between theme and concept, developing a premise, is that stronger idea that, as I said, doesn't get you stuck on Act Three. Something that you can is more of a developed notion rather than a simplistic concept. We're not really talking about generating high concept ideas. They're often very quick to, it's very difficult to generate high concept kind of off the cuff. Um, our goal really, I think, as Mike mentioned it once, was substance more than anything, and crafting a strong screenplay. And further to that, how to really make your story stand out. So let's get started.
Okay, so the first thing that we're going to look at is what is theme. And number one, I'll take it from there, Chris. Describe it. So in a few words, this is the subjects explored by your film. That ultimately is your theme. It's not really about plot or character at this stage. It's more like the universal concept that can be applied to anyone, regardless of race, gender, or creed. Ultimately, what we're looking at here is the theme being the underlying message or central idea that your story will explore. Theme is what the story is truly about on a deeper level. So conflicting philosophical beliefs will provide more engaging stories, and they create inherent tension that drives the narratives forward as well. No idea and no situation is ever strong enough to carry you through to a logical conclusion without a clearly defined theme. In short, every story is an argument the writer is going to be waging. The more intriguing the argument, the more engaging the story. Conflict is the heart of drama, as most people would understand. And when characters embody conflicting beliefs, it naturally leads to tension, struggles, and growth. So to identify theme in this section, we suggest you start with broad concepts that have universal relevance. Now, when we talk about universal, we're really saying here that they're timeless and they resonate with just about everyone. Normally you'll find this to be like a versus argument. So you'll see things like man versus nature. Inception was dreams versus reality. You have love versus hate, justice versus revenge. There are countless examples of this. Put simply, something that most people can relate to. Stories teach us about how to live by dramatizing those common themes that are central to our lives. So good themes speak to profound and shared elements of the human experience. So it's only natural that certain themes reappear again and again in films. It's actually why sometimes you might find that you're really drawn to certain genres, for example. It's normally because they actually look at the same theme again and again, and it's explored throughout a different story. So when choosing your theme, you must ensure that the beliefs are truly conflicting. I think that's the most important part. They should represent fundamentally different worldviews and values that can't easily coexist. Of course, it would be reductive to say that any film can, if it's simply about justice or revenge. A theme is actually the inferred stance of that topic of the story. So, for example, if we look at something like revenge as being your theme, that might be the overriding subject of the screenplay, but the theme derived from that subject may be something like revenge destroys everything and everyone, including the person seeking it. So now you have something that can drive your characters, you have something that can drive your dialogue, and you can have something that can drive the plot of your film as well. So this is why theme is often presented as a question or statement. For example, if you look at a film, not sure how many will be familiar with it, but When Harry Met Sally, the theme was best described as, can men and women be friends?
Yeah. So looking then at the element of stating it, this effectively is a notion that everything has purpose or theme. So every second of our life has its own theme it follows, whether we're conscious of it or not. This is usually why a number of screenwriters struggle finding or deciding on a theme, as personal affinity to one is more subconscious. For most, the themes you explore are going to be rooted in the personal experiences that make your voice unique. Theme is really the writer's view of the world. It's more of a moral perspective. So it's expressing it to an audience really is the sole purpose of why we choose to tell a story. When it's executed well, the theme permeates the entire screenplay without openly stating it, which is pretty much the key. The subject of Shrek, for example, could be described as prejudice versus self-esteem. And so while the theme may be distilled down to don't judge a book by its cover.
Yeah.
Um,
And
so
the next section we've got is define it. So this is where we would define the theme as a proposition, as Chris mentioned, supposed or proved, a basis of an argument, and ultimately leading to a conclusion. Others will have different names for this, whether it's the thesis, the root, the central idea, the goal, the aim, the subject, but that's ultimately what all of those words are essentially saying theme. So though they are related, the moral of the story and the theme are not the same thing. If you think of the theme as a common question the story will investigate, the moral becomes the message or lesson we're meant to take away from the screenplay. So this is where, when we talk about very good films, it's the ones that leave the audience at the end thinking, as opposed to just immediately forgetting the film. This is where Chris was saying before that we really are talking here about substance over spectacle. And navigating between the theme and the moral can be tricky. So, because most of the time readers or audiences don't really want to be preached to. So this is why it's up to the writer to provide a perspective on the central idea. And that's why we create the argument. Ultimately, when we're talking about the argument, it's the thing that is going to be constantly driving the script. So every single time we have, and it's the same dialogue, every piece of dialogue should be an argument. And every character, every piece of in within the screenplay will service that argument.
yeah. And I will say for those, I know everyone's going to be taking notes as well. For the elements for describing it, staying there is we will share a basic kind of very quick breakdown of each of these points just to kind of reiterate that with everyone after the class. And I also have a marking criteria sheet that we actually use at Writers by Writers that was developed by Coverfly. So you'll find most screenplay competitions actually use the same marking sheet. So I will, as a follow-up, I will make sure to share it at the end of at the end, or probably tomorrow, but I will make sure to share it with everyone just so that you can have it. Really, it's just a list of questions in terms of marking criteria when we're looking at screenplays, elements like genre and what it is when what we talk about genre, what do we mean and what are the questions readers are actually asking, which hopefully again just further gives you an opportunity or a better understanding of how Coverfly or any competition through the platform actually marks.
Yeah, I think ultimately it just further elaborates on the scorecards that we all get, whether it's through the blacklist or whether it's for a competition.
Yeah.
It essentially explains why certain things are being marked the way they are.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. So when we talk about connecting to the theme, really, in its simplest form, what are you as a filmmaker trying to say? It's almost always how a writer or director connects to the material, and this is why the story has to be told by you. If we look at examples like Taika Waititi, often most of his stories are centered around a theme of strained father-son relationships. That was his approach, of my understanding of it, that helped him secure the Thor movie and how he connected himself to the material. We know that the difficult relationship with Spielberg had with his father was a narrative force behind many of his films, with most of them having a strained father-son relationship. And in the case of Catch Me If You Can, even another character becomes an actual surrogate father. So really, as I say, this element really is just how you as a writer connect individually to that material and that theme. And I think the nice thing about this, and I use two examples really there that are writer directors. But often as a writer, you'll find you'll come into it with one particular theme, and another theme may come out of it through working with the director. That often happens, I know, with Denis Villeneuve, who'll take a script on and develop his own themes, or will find scripts where there are themes present he's already interested and can attach himself to, and so it further develops through that principle.
I,
So it's
I think the
important.
most important, sorry to interrupt you there, Chris. I think the most important part of that, the connect to it, is you're always going to be asked the question, why are you the one to tell this story? And ultimately, that is going to answer it. And the thing is, what we're going to talk about throughout this class as well is that we found ourselves, and I think it's the case with most writers, the more you write, you find yourself exploring the similar themes again and again. And that's when you're going to realize that is ultimately your voice, and that is how you connect to the material. Whether you're writing in sci-fi or action or drama, where if your themes are connected to you, then you will be able to connect to the material.
And just to follow up on that point as well, I think the most important for those, I guess, for those on the more greener side of the writing, that understanding that writing is simply a requirement to unearth those themes is probably one of the most crucial things Mike and I learned in the early stages of our writing.
It's
Uh,
like a therapy, really.
yeah. And I think it's not until you've written that you begin to understand why you're writing and those themes that are interesting, because those are what make you stand out. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but that really is what highlights your voice as a writer. So it's crucial to be cognizant of it, so that you can further elaborate on those themes as you write.
Yeah. Okay, so the next section we have is formulate it. And what we mean by this is that every good film must have a well-formulated theme. So as I mentioned before, no idea, no situation in plot or character development will ever be strong enough to carry you through to that ultimate goal, the logical conclusion, without a really clearly defined theme. Unfortunately, I don't like to use examples and say that certain films are terrible, but if you don't do this, you will likely end up writing the next Sharknado. And apologies to those of you who maybe really enjoyed that film, but what we're saying here is that those type of films aren't memorable 20, 30, 40 years down the line. Those stories are spectacle over substance. And that's why when we look at cinema, we keep coming back to the examples. And you're gonna see that Chris and I are huge fans of the likes of Spielberg and other great directors that you're all familiar with. It's because they are really, really strong on their theme. And that's why the material lasts the test of time.
Yes. So, I mean, not to put off anyone that wants to write a Sharknado. I think the best version of us is that version that writes a version of it with substance. I also think, particularly when you're trying to break into the industry, it's the easiest way to validate yourself is to say, is I have something to say. And touching on those themes, they often tend to be universal and is something most audiences connect to. Um, so moving on to aim it, basically, if you have no theme, you may modify, elaborate, or even vary your original idea, but you never know where you're going to be going. You have to remember that theme is unmistakable goal that your film aims to achieve.
I think this is the section, Chris. Sorry to interrupt you there, but that's also the section where, when you spoke before about running out of steam come the midpoint,
Yeah.
the tail end of the act three is not really turning out the way you want it to. I think that is where this comes into it. If you really have a strong theme and you know what you're trying to say, then your screenplay will naturally unfold over 120 minutes or 120 pages really, really easily.
Yeah, and I think that arguably is the most important aspect of it is really theme as a driving force to your material makes it that much easier. Not only makes it that much easier to write, but also makes it that much easier for an audience to follow. If there's no cohesiveness to the theme that you're attempting, if it feels broken, you will lose your audience. So without a theme at all, characters will do and say whatever the screenplay requires to get to the next scene and string kind of some semblance of a plot together. This is also why we often have exposition dumps or sudden action, usually because the lack of a cohesive idea for the film prevents the writer from putting together a natural sequence. With imagery in film, it becomes more extravagant. Pretty much like we've said before, weak scripts are a spectacle over substance. But at the heart of a great script is, as I said, a universal theme. So a beautifully told story is a symphonic unity which structure, setting, character, dialogue, and genre all service the argument. And those again, talking about marking criteria, those are pretty much the marking criteria that we look at when we're marking scripts within competitions. And I don't speak just to writers by writers in that vein. I talk as a screenwriting director who's also helped set up other screenwriting competitions. Um,
And I think just to add to that point, Chris, as well, when we look at those as individual things, you could have a great structure. You could have really interesting characters and you can have really compelling dialogue. But when we're talking about a great script, it's something that's doing all those things really well, but then it's combining them all together and they're working together. I think that's the
yeah.
key.
I mean, I would say like the conductor of an orchestra, the writer, has to control the elements of the stories first separately, then in a concert. So if you remember that a strong script comes from having something to say, a theme that you're presenting to the reader, that's what really sells the material and the script itself.
Yeah, and so the next section, this is where Chris and I actually termed this the promise of the premise section, but this is where you're going to prove it. So using the above examples, most statements or such statements do not always ring true, and they may offer opinionated questions posed by the writer. But likewise, statements and questions may often be used interchangeably here. So when we looked at the example of when Harry met Sally, and we said, "Can men and women be friends?" You could also say, or men and women aren't capable of being friends. So that's where you would have the argument coming in. The next step is to set about essentially proving this theme. So this will be done by showing both sides of the argument and then forming a logical conclusion. I'm not sure if many of you had seen the film You People on Netflix, but that really was a film that was showing one side of an argument and continually hammering home the point of that one side of the argument. And because it didn't show the other side, then you're not necessarily engaging the audience. You're essentially preaching to them. So often the theme may be stated within the film. Sometimes, if you look structurally, sometimes this is actually in dialogue by the main character or in the presence of the main character. Typically, if you're adhering to really strict screenplay structure, it's often around page 5. We'll have a couple of examples that we'll go through where you'll see with very successful films, they've actually done this and it's really quite on the nose, but you can do it more subtly, I think.
Yeah. And then the final point is really that you have to believe in it. And I can't stress this enough. You have to believe your theme. This is also the principle of why it's so important to find themes that relate to you. Often the theme is that theme is important to you, and you have to believe in it since you're setting out to prove it. So the theme should be a conviction of your own. That's why, as I said, you need to find, as a writer, you need to find and explore the themes which are close to you, and that comes through the material and the natural exploration of the subconscious. As I said, writing and continually writing over time is the easiest way. As difficult as it is to say that, and as easy as it sounds or simplistic, that's the easiest way for you to figure out what are the themes, if with some form of introspection. And it's also why readers and viewers connect so easily to the material because they genuinely believe those ideas that the person arguing those points believes it themselves. Um, so I think, yeah, that pretty much for us sums up the culmination, I guess, of theme itself. When we look at the idea of multiple themes, theme is not always limited to a single article. So a vast number of films commit to the exploration of multiple themes, and usually rely on one all-encompassing question.
Yeah,
Uh,
so I think in this instance, a good screenplay will have that major theme that the story is seeking to convey. That's kind of the fundamental idea around the plot, the characters, and the events will revolve. However, a layered screenplay will also incorporate minor themes that support, complement, or contrast that major theme. So if we go along to the next one, Chris, we'll look at some examples of this
Yeah,
anyway.
I think it's easier. It's always easier. I mean, most people are familiar with films, even whether you've seen the film or not. You have some understanding of it. If you haven't seen the examples, do watch them. For Mike and I, it was the easiest. It's the easiest way to use film as an
And
exposition.
I'd also, just sorry to interrupt again, Chris, I'd also like to apologize in advance that we are using The Godfather. I know this came up in the latest Barbie film, that your boyfriend will always talk about The Godfather. But for
Mhm.
Chris and I, unfortunately, it does really explain what we're trying to say. But yeah, we also are huge fans of The Godfather. So
Yes.
apologies.
There are basically with The Godfather, there are multiple themes at play. The two we're looking at are loyalty and power corrupts. When it comes to loyalty, in the world of The Godfather, loyalty is currency. A man's word is more valuable than money. So in the first scene, Buonasera wants the Godfather to help him seek revenge on his daughter's attackers. Doesn't cost him money, and Corleone is insulted by the offer, but rather his loyalty. If we look at the actual excerpt, Don Corleone says, "Then take the justice from the judge, the bitter with the sweet, Bonacera. But if you come to me with your friendship, your loyalty stated, then your enemies become my enemies, and then believe me, they will fear you." I mean, a spoiler alert, but betrayal also means certain death. And when we move on to the kind of also, we move on looking at the notion of also that power corrupts, the morality of story that power corrupts a man's loyalty, even to himself and his own morality. In The Godfather, the characters are changed by the ebb and flow of power. We're presented to Don Corleone as an omniscient being from the beginning, and by his death, he's just a scruffy old man lying in a tomato patch. If we look at Michael, on the other hand, he starts the film as a young man trying to find his way and claims more of his father's legacy and power. So his moral compass kind of goes haywire, clouding the compassion that he once possessed. And with that, the filmmaker successfully proves the premise that power corrupts. As The Godfather is a story about power and morality, the writer, Mario Puzo, focused on developing rich, complex characters whose conflicts and motivations drove the narrative toward what is effectively a logical conclusion. Um,
Yeah, so then on to another one of our favorites, Jurassic Park. This film explores the minor theme of parenthood and the major theme of the dangers of technological progress. So if we first look at the minor theme, fatherhood or parenthood, when it comes to this in Jurassic Park, we are shown in the very early exchanges that Dr. Alan Grant or Sam Neill is not a father, nor does he ever intend to be. Of course, once he is trapped in the park alone with the grandchildren of John Hammond, Richard Attenborough, he is forced to become that father figure. So you'll see this is I mean, it's all throughout the first 10 pages of the script. There's a moment where he's looking at some fossils and he picks up a claw and then he has an exchange with a young boy and he says to Ellie that he doesn't like children. And then later on, he says, on this dialogue extract that we have here, he said, why do they have to bring their kids? And then later on in the exchange, he says, if you really want to scare the kid, you could have pulled a gun on him. He says, yeah, I know, kids, you want one of those. And toward the end of the film, when Grant and the children are hiding in the tree, we observe the character change. So it's highlighted again. I think we've got it written there, page 105 of the script, that both kids finally close their eyes, but after a moment, Lex pops hers open again. What if the dinosaur comes back while we're asleep? I'll stay awake. So what we've seen here is that his arc is complete. He went from scaring children in the beginning to protecting them.
sorry, Mike, to interrupt, but I think the most important element, and we talk about multiple themes in stories. Jurassic Park is a fantastic example purely because it's one of those examples that, or similar to The Godfather, began life as a novel and was developed into a feature film. when we look at, and we talked about it earlier, when we look at Spielberg's writing, Spielberg's stories, they often revolve around the notion of father-son relationships, or by the very minimum, fatherhood, um, which I guess we can ascertain by this point is Spielberg's goal when it came to the writing of this particular script. Because
Yeah, I
if we
think
look at
that,
sorry, Mike, but not just to finish the note, if we look at what Michael Crichton's argument was, which I think Mike's going to talk about next,
yeah.
that the danger of technology. So this is where we see a strong example of a writer who comes into something with their version of a theme, and a director or filmmaker who often comes in with the version of their theme that they want to tell. And this is why we find so many strong layered versions of films. As I said, particularly happens with Spielberg, with Denis Villeneuve, people who come on board and develop screenplays with a view to achieving the themes that they want to explore.
Yeah, and I think what works so well in this example as well is how both themes that seem to be disconnected, the dangers of technology and parenthood, they actually work really well in harmony. So you have an instance here where the dangers of technology is going to be expressed by dinosaurs escaping from a park, but then you've got a guy in a park who's having to look after children. So you've actually got two themes at work that are working in harmony. And Chris is exactly right. I think Michael Crichton, when we look at that, he originally wanted to debate whether technological progress was a good thing, and more specifically, if humanity's desire for progress would push us beyond what nature intended toward playing God. That was the ultimate idea of Jurassic Park. But the problem you have there is, whilst that worked very well in a novel form, it doesn't necessarily connect universally to audiences.
Mhm.
One thing audiences can all associate with, or in the most case, is we've either had a, well, in every case, sorry, we've either had a parent or we are a parent. Everybody goes through it. So the original idea for Jurassic Park was actually a graduate student who used technology to recreate a dinosaur. But it was actually there that Crichton arrived at a problem and explained that kind of that research is tremendously expensive. So then it was the other thing that came to it was how would you how would you explain that? And the only thing he could think of was that it would come from a desire for entertainment. So that's where we got the idea of the park. So if we now go on to the next stage, danger of technology. Okay. So throughout Jurassic Park, we're actually introduced to the major theme, which is nature versus progress, and the idea that unbridled progress will lead to our demise. So early in the film, again, if we look at this dialogue line, we see that Dr. Alan Grant sets this up for the audience. He says, "I hate computers." But this is it's actually through another character, Ian Malcolm, played by Jeff Goldblum, that we really explore this theme. So throughout the film, Malcolm questions the integrity of the park. On page 41, he continues to warn us and says that the lack of humility before nature that has been displayed here staggers me. So ultimately, this dialogue line foreshadows the events that will unfold. And then by page 35, we've got John, the kind of control you're attempting is not possible. If there's one thing in history of evolution has taught us, it's that life will not be contained. Life breaks free, it expands to new territories, it crashes through barriers painfully, maybe even dangerously. So this is actually, I mean, in terms of dialogue, it's actually explained the entire film for us. But this is something that Chris and I will delve more into with our book. But to give an overview, and this applies to almost every film, you will actually always find that the protagonist of the film, in this case, Sam Neill or Alan Grant, will find themselves caught in the middle of the thematic argument. And on both sides, we will always find characters who embody each side of the theme. So if you look at Jurassic Park as an example, progress is embodied by John Hammond. So his dream of creating Jurassic Park epitomizes humanity's desire to control and commercialize nature. On the other hand, we have Dr. Ian Malcolm, who is the voice of caution and nature. His skepticism and chaos theory highlight the unpredictable power of nature and the hubris of human endeavor. And stuck right in that middle is the conflicted protagonist, Dr. Alan Grant, a man who is obsessed with dinosaurs but hates technology. So through character, plot, symbol, and dialogue, Jurassic Park effectively delivered on the promise of its premise by exploring the complex relationship between human progress and the untamable power of nature.
So moving on from that, we'll look at obviously touch on concept and what exactly concept is. In a sentence or two, it's just the concept of the film. I think we're all familiar to that note. It often becomes the principal logline of the film, describing the plot in its simplest form. If we look at the examples that we have here, when a killer shark unleashes chaos, excuse me, unleashes chaos on a beach community, it's up to a local sheriff, a marine biologist, and an old seafarer to hunt the beast down. A team of explorers travels through a wormhole in space in an attempt to ensure humanity's survival. And with the help of a German bounty hunter, a freed slave sets out to rescue his wife from a brutal Mississippi plantation owner. In their simplest forms, a concept really is just what is the film at its simplest meaning.
Yeah, so then we've got the attention grabbers. And for these ones, we're looking at the concept is what makes your material stand out as original. So the higher the concept, the more likely you are to grab attention. And the more instantaneously the audience can picture the conceivable plot in their mind. So if you look at, again, we use Jurassic Park as an example here, a park is created where dinosaurs are brought back to life. That is as attention grabbing as you can possibly get. And then you've got E.T., a boy befriends an alien he finds in his garden. So the concepts hook the reader and make them want to learn more about the world you've created.
And then we have ones that are really nothing but the concept. So there's similar. Often the film is pretty much the title is the concept. The Invention of Lying, Snakes on a Plane, Groundhog Day. Without watching any of these films or reading any more about them, you pretty much know what they'll be about. So it's the simplest in form in terms of concept.
Yeah. Okay, so then we've got what is the premise? So the first step toward creating a unique concept is to have two distinct and seemingly incompatible elements which externalize the theme the story tackles. Now, I know that's a lot to take in, but what we're essentially saying here is the premise can be thought of as a concise overview that encapsulates the core conflict of the story. So it's going to provide a snapshot of the narrative's essence by highlighting the main characters, their goals, and the primary source of conflict. That's essentially where you also find a logline. Almost all stories we look at will have two incompatible elements. So if you look at a high concept film like Jaws, for example, we look at the incompatible elements of a great white shark and a peaceful beach town. Whilst a low concept idea might look at a king and a debilitating speech impediment, which obviously was the king's speech. But you'll see here that every story has those things. It has the two incompatible elements, and more importantly, it has conflict, be it external like Jaws or internal like the king's speech. No matter where your idea fits on that scale of concept, when we talk about high concept, low concept films, it will need conflict. So in short, the premise will set the stage for how the identified philosophical beliefs or themes will be externalized within the story. And when we and this is where it becomes a little bit confusing, but externalization essentially means taking the abstract ideas. So, for instance, if you look at something like Jaws, you've got fear and rationality, which is something we'll touch on later. But it's taking abstract ideas like that or internal conflicts and expressing them through tangible, observable elements. This makes complex themes more accessible and engaging to the audience. So, using Jaws as an example, we take the abstract idea of fear, which is embodied by the tangible, observable element of a great white shark, and we take the abstract idea of rationality, which will be embodied by the tangible, observable element of the scientific approach to stopping the shark. So when doing this, it's important for the elements to naturally conflict. So highlighting the tension between the beliefs they represent. What's more, these elements should be integral to the story, so influencing character decisions, plot progression, thematic development. Again, when we talk about like Jaws, we see that conceptualizing it would have required the writer to consider various aspects of each philosophical belief, thinking about characters, setting, events that could personify those beliefs. Conflict in Jaws arises as Brody and Hooper's attempts to close the beach and study the shark are in direct opposition with the shark's attack and the townspeople's panic. So the struggle to protect the town from the shark, rationality, amidst the growing chaos, fear, creates the film's central tension. There can be countless iterations of concepts, but the strongest of those tie to the core concept of the theme, thus creating a fully rounded premise.
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned before, for Mike and I, the notion of premise, or at least what we mean by it, is this culmination of concept and theme that lands us at the principle of understanding. And I think without that, this is why we look so heavily weighted on theme, because it's so crucial to understanding really what a film is. Uh,
Yeah, I think
Not understand. Sorry, Mike.
I think if you look at it, so if we're talking about us all being writers here, and we're saying we're going to create an entirely new story, then that story might be something like, okay, let's do a film about a bear attack. That's our concept, right? We've got our concept. But if we do not add theme into it in any way, one thing we're going to find is it's actually extremely difficult to push this narrative along in terms of character and dialogue, because that should be driven by theme. But the other thing we're going to have is we're not actually going to have what we're talking about here is the premise. We're going to have an extremely strong concept. And that's where we talk about films that are falling, foul of that kind of spectacle over substance thing that we spoke about earlier, where you're not really seeing anything beyond the surface level of the film.
Yeah, and I think if we're looking at the some of the greatest films, be that Oscar winners or award winners or simply strong films that we remember, theme is always a prevalent factor when it comes to those particular films.
Even
Uh,
extremely, sorry to interrupt again, Chris, but even extremely complex films. A lot
mm,
of people look at film like The Matrix and they say it's extremely complex, but the theme is so easy: freedom versus control. And it's externalized by the rebellion and the Matrix. And we see this in literally shown to us by them showing which pill do you want to take? Do you want
yeah,
freedom or do you want?
that in itself, the notion that encompasses the entirety of that premise, the red pill over the blue pill, immediately personifies what that film is, and it
And,
tells
and,
you
and
that's your takeaway.
yeah, and to stay on this section for a moment, Chris, it's also when we talk about universal ideas and things like that, when we spoke about Jaws as being a memorable film, if you look at another film, which is, I mean, it literally is the exact same theme. This is where we talk about themes are universal, themes can be seen again and again and again. Arachnophobia does the exact same thing as Jaws. It looks at the theme of rationality and fear, externalized by the expertise of the science community and obviously the spiders. And in that one, we had the conflict occurred where Dr. Jennings and Dr. Atherton had to work together despite their differing approaches to the spider crisis. But in this instance, we're seeing the exact same themes popping up again in the same genre. And that's something that you're going to see, or if you do read anything like John Truby, he's got a book out that's called The Anatomy of Genres. He talks about specific genres that constantly look at the same themes. This is why I said earlier that you might have certain films that if you love sci-fi, for instance, deep down, it will be because sci-fi looks at certain themes that are really connected to you. And yeah,
And,
so
and and again, touching on what Mike said, I think using arachnophobia is a fantastic example of one that encompasses a strong premise where we have strong concepts and a strong concept and strong themes. And the themes need to be, when we talked about it in the beginning when we touched on theme, but the importance of understanding what a theme is, particularly in a film, is crucial to keeping your audience's attention, or by the very minimum, feeling as though you've repaid that attention by the end of the film. If we look at examples like The Meg or The Shallows, those are particular examples where theme is not as easily recognizable. Therefore, the films tend to be less memorable because we can't exactly remember what the story was, or short of the plot line. They tend to be action or event driven and often forgettable. Which is why we state the importance of premise, particularly at the writing stage. When we're looking at screenplays and if we're looking at becoming better writers, the notion really that we want to make, we want to write a screenplay that has substance, that is something producible. Because short of strong visuals, strong action, those are all elements that can be added by someone other than the writer. The notion of theme is something that's not interchangeable without the writer. This is
Yeah.
why we often find when someone says, "Why you? Why now? What's your voice?" They get an understanding of you as a writer. That's why we consider it. We consider premise to be the most important factor, and particularly theme, when it comes to writing your material. That's why we hammer it home so hard, because it's clear time and time again that really is what stands you out as a writer.
In all
Um,
honesty, when you're reading unproduced screenplays, is what a lot of them are missing. And when you do read very good screenplays, you see that it is in there, and obviously produced films, it's pretty much always in there, except for the obviously the few examples that unfortunately for them we do talk down about.
I,
They
I don't, yeah, I don't think necessarily we
have a
speak down on
place.
them. They tend to be less forgettable, sorry, more forgettable, and that tends to be merely down to the fact that the lack of a universal theme means there's less meaning to the story.
I think the lack of a theme means there's a lack of an argument,
Yeah.
and therefore you're not going to have characters who are interesting. You're
They
not
feel
going
undeveloped. Yeah, underdeveloped
to,
characters.
everything just feels a little bit cookie cutter.
Yeah.
Um,
So then, talking of voice, how do you find it? When we're looking at finding it through the culmination of theme or by premise, if I mean, Mike and I will hammer it home all the time, but if we consider Steven Spielberg and the links of his films thematically, fatherhood, it's clear that much of his work is closely linked to his relationship with his father, and that is a prevalent factor in his thematic approach. Spielberg admitted E.T. was inspired due to the divorce of his own parents, which directly affected his material. Apologies. And so it's kind of when it comes to the kind of Jurassic Park, AI, Catch Me If You Can, Indiana Jones, War of the Worlds, each example of his work provides a reflection of his thematic approach to fatherhood. The worries of becoming a father, the lack of a father figure, the strained fathered relationships. It doesn't really matter what the concept is. What matters is how the link to the theme, how he links it to the theme of the story.
I
Uh,
think just quickly, Chris, to touch on that before you continue, one of the reasons Chris and I really connect with this is we actually found in our own work that we were constantly looking at things like isolation. And it continued to come up. We were writing about isolated characters and everything like that. And ultimately, when we talk about writing as being a form of therapy, Chris and I, our father left when he was very young. And we found that we were essentially telling that story through our work. And that's why ultimately I find that we do connect to his material, because we're telling the same kind of stuff. We find that those themes interesting. And I think that's where sometimes when people talk about theme, it can be quite a heady subject, and it can be difficult to kind of establish, what themes am I going to tell, or what. Sometimes the best way is to look at the films that you're interested in, look at the directors or writers that you like, and you'll probably find they're looking at or expressing the same themes, and there'll be a reason subconsciously why you're attracted to that material. And you probably find even the material, if is mirrored throughout your own work as well. Sorry, Chris.
I think it's also for us, Spielberg is a very easy example because the theme is so clear.
Yeah,
Whether it's linked to the concept or whether it's just so prevalent in the writing and in the story itself. That he's a great example for us really to kind of to use as a highlight because it's the most understandable version. But as a filmmaker and not only as a writer, this is often how you make the project your own as well. So when we're talking about the voice, The answer really to how you find a connection to your material is through that theme. Often it can either be there or it can be something that you impart during or the writing or rewriting process. How theme relates to the writer is crucial, really, in understanding what to consider when you're developing your material. This is what make you stand out in the pitch room, which is the reason only you can tell this story. That's your go-to response, and I promise you, if you continue a career in screenwriting, you are going to get asked why you. This is the answer. This is the most simple way of figuring out why you're the person to tell this story and what is important, why it's important to you. And no one can argue with that. As we've said before, if you're able to make it an argument that you firmly believe in and you argue that through, immediately the your voice stands out. You have something to say. And that is why, to us, it's the most crucial element of a screenplay, because as a writer, this is how you tie yourself to the material.
Yeah, and likewise, like Chris mentioned earlier about Taika Waititi, this is if you were ever in a room and, for instance, you were asked if you wanted to do the next Batman. If you can find a way to connect to that material, which Taika did with Thor, making it about a father-son relationship, and that is exactly how you will have the same sort of success by getting into that room and working your material or your themes into existing material or existing IP. Okay, so the next section we have is making it universal. So again, we are going to look at two films here. One which was successful and one which was maybe a little bit less successful. So theme and strong concepts can lack in material. And there are some fantastic examples of films which haven't necessarily fully applied either. So the concept can be hard to describe, but it's still there, or the theme can be difficult to comprehend, but it's still there. But without the two combined, the material will always suffer. All great films have a strong connection of the two. So combining what we call the premise, is what will set the material apart from similar films. So if we look at these two examples that we've got here, we've got Arrival and Battle Los Angeles. So in Battle Los Angeles, the concept is very high. A squad of US Marines become the last line of defense against a global invasion. That's the logline of the film. Now, the film is cinematic for sure, but without the glitz and glamour of the visual effects, the film is lacking a truly universal theme that emotionally connects the audiences with the material. That's why in this film in particular, the characters don't necessarily feel very strong. The dialogue doesn't feel very strong. There's a lot of elements that start to fall away. And often these films rely on ensemble cast and visuals to essentially get them across the line. If you look at the critical response to this film, I think Rotten Tomatoes gave it an average rating of 4 point something out of 10. And I think the consensus was that it was overlong and overly burdened, with war movie cliches. If we look at Arrival, we're still in this realm of the science fiction alien invasion. However, the concept is high. A linguist works with the military to communicate with alien life forms after 12 mysterious crafts appear around the world. But unlike Battle Los Angeles, Arrival delivers an alien invasion sci-fi with a universal theme. So that's where it's important. Only through communication can we overcome our problems. So in this film, this could just easily have been a film about a relationship as it was about aliens landing on Earth. And that's what made it universal. So Arrival anchors this simple, heady theme in a sci-fi setting, delivering an introspective, philosophical, and existentially inclined statement in an unwavering tenor of chest-tightening sci-fi. And in this instance, Metacritic, I think they gave it like something like 81 out of 100, and it received universal acclaim. So if we look at this, if you consider, again, we're looking in this same sort of realm of alien films, sci-fi films, we look at another one, was District 9. So the central conflict of this film is an oppressor who is forced to walk a mile in the shoes of someone he's oppressing. So thematically, District 9 is a story whose subject is about xenophobia versus empathy. And this is designed to mimic the institutional racism in South Africa. So already we're looking at something that's way deeper than just an alien invasion film. And that's why audiences or readers who are reading the material would have connected to it a lot more than just, the spectacle of aliens landing on Earth. And this thematic clarity allowed for a deeper exploration of social, ethical, and philosophical issues. So in contrast to a film like Battle Los Angeles, which focused more on the action, which while entertaining lacks the same level of kind of thematic depth and emotional resonance. So what we are saying here that these films do obviously have a place, and a lot of people will love these films, but they will be forgotten in 20, 30 years, whereas other films will stand the test of time because they are connecting to audiences on a deeper level. By starting with the premise, it is likely for a screenplay to become cliche or formulaic because it ultimately it lacks direction. And no amount of spectacle will save the story that is not thematically gripping. I think that's ultimately what we're trying to say here. Again, though, apologies for anybody who did enjoy Battle Los Angeles. It just works to kind of service our point here.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we can all enjoy films regardless of the level of character depth or theme that they derive.
Oh, 100%.
Simply, I mean,
My
at the end of the day,
favorite film, my
film is
favorite
a,
film is Con Air, which
it's
some people would say is horrible, but we do have different reasons why we all enjoy different films for sure.
Yeah, and I think really when it comes to this, I think for us the class was not really an opportunity to slate other films as to why they're not good versions. It's really just as a writer how to become a better writer and how to improve on the material that you look to push forward. How can you stand out from everybody else? Because what we often find, and I've read countless iterations of the material through through the competition or other contests or through the work of friends, that you recognize the importance of standing out because a lot of people overlook, particularly the notion of theme. Everybody's looking for, a very clever, smart, high concept idea, but without that level of, and I think you'll find short of, arguably the greatest high concept of films, nowadays it's getting harder and harder to make something, particularly at a high-end scale. So the argument is really that we need to ensure our writing is as strong as it can be, and that really for us is where the principle of premise or theme, kind of comes into it.
Yeah, and I think it's also important on that section as well to say that ultimately we were looking at different examples of what is essentially the same story, alien sci-fi films. But when you start to add in theme, you make it different to something we've seen before. So when you look at something like Arrival, it was something we hadn't seen before. When you look back to the original Alien film, and it was really kind of about motherhood, then it was something that at the time we hadn't seen before. When you saw E.T. and it was about a boy who essentially wanted to befriend an alien, it's something we hadn't seen. So these are all, in every instance, it was a way of having a universal theme, but in the same kind of, as we spoke about before, and we'll talk about here, the same genre or the same kind of space as a film we've seen before.
Yeah. And so kind of on that note, when it comes to genre, it's obviously crucial to note that we can't discuss premise without touching on genre. So from a foundational perspective, genre really is tied to both concept and theme. And this really is the medium or the format of which the story is told at a base level in its simplest understanding of what you might expect from a film. However, it is not limited to that definition. So where a genre may be used interchangeably between concept and theme. If you look at examples of inherently genre films that are set apart by kind of those what's the notion?
Thematic approaches.
Thematic approach. If we look at, move it on, the same genre, but obviously a different concept or theme. have Get Out. Both are horrors. The notion of Get Out as the theme really is about racism, and if the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, famously, for those unaware, the theme there was about vegetarianism.
which is a
Uh,
strange. Yeah.
yeah, and so kind of Get Out uses the genre and the tropes of horror to make a statement and a social commentary on the base of race, whereas Texas Chainsaw Massacre utilizes the same tropes and genre, but really as an allegory for vegetarianism, which allows humans to be slaughtered for meat in a in a similar capacity to animals. If we look at
Yeah, so then we've got same concept, different genre and theme. So if we look at the two here, we've got Shaun of the Dead, which was a comedy horror, and we have 28 Days Later, which was an action horror. Both successful films, but Shaun of the Dead and 28 Days Later use the horror subgenre, so, but in different ways. So the success of both examples lie in their ability to shift the genre threads and conventions by incorporating new themes and additional genres. So if we analyze something like Shaun of the Dead, for example, this film used the zombie subgenre and its own conventions and tropes for comic effect. But Shaun of the Dead wasn't just like a great pun on George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead. It actually utilized the genre it spoofs to navigate the theme of complacency versus responsibility. So again, we're looking at theme coming in here very strong. So using the framework we talked about before, where we have the protagonist in the middle, in this instance, we'll find the character of Ed, who I think was played by Nick Frost, embodying complacency. And he is content with a laid back lifestyle, showing little ambition or willingness to take responsibility. And on the other side of the argument, we found the character of Liz embodying responsibility. She desired something more. She wanted a mature, meaningful life, and which was pushing Shaun to take more responsibilities and grow up. That's something that continually comes up in the dialogue throughout the film. Again, and we will talk about this more in our book, but positioned in the middle, we find caught between the theme, the protagonist Shaun. So he's initially complacent, which is shown at the start of the film, but he's forced to make a choice between remaining in his comfort zone with Ed or stepping out to take responsibility, essentially, pushing forward his relationship with Liz. In the same way, we found that Shaun's character arc reflects this theme, with the catalyst for change being the zombie outbreak. So that's just one way, obviously, you can have the same concept, looking at different themes and everything like that.
And if we look at the same premise with a different theme, or we look at, for example, aliens trapped in space, use two examples, particularly in the sequel version of Alien and then Aliens. What sets Alien apart from its sequel is the decision to shift themes and overall genre blending, which really allowed an entirely different take on the original premise. So although the concept remains the same for each of the films, obviously that these humans are trapped with deadly aliens in space, the film feels entirely original and offers a new perspective to the previous iteration. It's also what makes the sequel so great. We know our hero survived and probably will again, so a piece of knowledge we didn't have, which is a piece of knowledge that we didn't have from the first film. But now we're rooting for her and given more of a universal theme that we can actually connect to.
And again, it's that thing that we spoke about before. This is a great example of how to do a sequel well. Because if you look at the original Alien, it was really looking at themes of motherhood. And come the second film, she's made to look after a child. So it's taking the themes from the original and it's kind of moving and elaborating them into the sequel. So anybody who is a fan of the first film will already be inherently drawn to the themes that are approached in the second film, although they feel different, which is I think a great thing. So here we've got same theme, different genre and concept. So ultimately here, what we're looking at is love conquers all. So we used When Harry Met Sally, which is a romance comedy, and we also have the Titanic, which was a drama romance. So when understanding common themes at work in a number of films, the genres and initial concepts can set apart what may be a consistent thread. The notion of love conquering all is quite tried and tested approach to theme. with a great deal of successful examples of films using it. The shift between When Harry Met Sally and Titanic can be as simple as the genre to change and the concept, so allowing both to remain uniquely individual. As you may have noticed, most themes are broad and universal, again, so which means we've likely seen them expressed over and over again. If you look at films in this same kind of same theme, different genre concept world, we look at things like Pinocchio, Blade Runner, Her. They're all exploring the same theme of what it means to be human, but across different genres and concepts.
Yeah, and then we have a look at the next, oh, apologies, same concept and different themes when it comes to, and again, this move looking at the principles of technology advancing and material protection. When it comes to, again, another iteration of a sequel, as a bonus example, consider the first two original Terminator films and how the only change remained the themes of technological advance and that of maternal protection. Those two examples, almost entirely the same film, but with the change allowing for a new, fresher premise, which leads to a more universal theme and arguably a far more successful follow-up, which then went on to spawn, countless iterations of a franchise. So if we're looking at those particular examples, and particularly as that of a sequel, we recognize the need to, as Mike said earlier, the need to actually develop the premise and alter the theme for sequels, and how that allows us to make a standout version when it comes to a sequel. When it comes to creating a premise, so looking to craft a premise, the initial difficulty is always lying the developing ideas from scratch. This is the notion we talked about, kind of how do we develop an idea effectively? And so you want to start your next script and have absolutely no idea where to begin, which unfortunately the theme is tied, as we've said earlier, to your kind of body of work, and is almost always subconscious, particularly in the early stages of your writing. This can make searching to better understand a theme a difficult principle when you have a limited amount of experience, or particularly a limited amount of writing. And as cliche as the approach sounds, the only real option to combat this, which I said earlier, really is to write. And you'll see some of the same examples appearing in your work over and over again. The more you write, the more you're going to notice the common things that you tend to explore. I think if we might, use Mike and I as an example, when we first started in the kind of early stages of our career, a lot I know particularly for Mike was about isolation, as an individual who tends to isolate himself from situations. Mine was, more, I guess, family orientated, or the notion of the need to surround myself with people. Those are themes we quickly recognize through, I think, as little as 2 to 3 scripts. Oh, sorry, Mike. As little as 2 to 3 scripts, that you begin to recognize that there's something there in terms of developing what it is you're trying to say.
Yeah, and it worked well for us in terms of co-writing, because as Chris expressed, I was looking at themes of isolation. Chris was looking at themes of community, and they just happened to be a versus argument, which worked really quite nicely for us. But ultimately, what we're trying to say here is that the very kind of core of storytelling is those two conflicting philosophical or moral beliefs that the story analyzes. That, whether it's going to be the love versus hate, the revenge versus justice, those universal themes are going to be the kind of the core of the story. So it should follow that a story's premise, when creating it, should be a natural extension of the philosophical conflict or theme. The premise must serve the themes. That's kind of the real key that we're trying to say here. So first, find the theme you want to explore and the argument you want to wage. And then there are actually three steps that Chris and I talk about in more depth in our book as well, that we would like to consider. So number one is characters that embody the theme. So create characters that deliver nuanced perspectives for both sides of the argument. You will often find your protagonist will fit nicely in the middle, as I mentioned before, which creates natural conflict as they have a choice to make. I think it was John Truby talks about the character web, um, and that's this similar kind of principle here, where you're having a web of characters that are created around a central kind of theme. The second point to this is settings that explore the theme. So choose settings and elements that best describe and externalize the ideas your story's trying to tackle. So if we look at Jurassic Park, technology was externalized by the scientific park, and nature, which was the other side of the argument, was externalized by probably the most extreme example of nature, dinosaurs. So in this instance, settings that explore the theme is kind of the next stage. And the last one that we're looking at is motifs and symbols that can enrich the theme. So when we're talking about writing the script, we want to include repeating narrative elements that support the theme. So if you look at, we'll take Jurassic Park as an example again. If you consider the tropical storm that hits the island, this is actually a symbol that supports the theme because it reinforces the idea of nature's unpredictable power. And I think that pretty much, those three steps, I think that pretty much sums up on the best way to kind of formulate a premise.
Yeah, so I think for us, really, when it comes to the kind of final considerations of over across the board, the notion of that to consider your theme and as we've said, whether that's through your writing or those topics or genres that you are drawn to, consider what it is that you really want to say or what your material is attempting to say. Whether that's an argument, whether that's you're posing a question, you need to find you need to fully understand what it is that you're trying to say, particularly as the writer. And then moving on from that to generate those questions or statements that will
Yeah,
afford you.
I
Sorry.
think on that generate the question statement section, because I think that asking questions of your theme kind of in order to find the premise, is that's what everybody calls the thematic exploration. This involves delving into the underlying ideas, messages, and concepts that form the foundation of the story. So what you're actually going to find a lot of people talk about in terms of storytelling is asking what if questions. So it's a common and effective technique for developing a premise of a story. By posing hypothetical scenarios, we can actually explore potential consequences, and then we can uncover intriguing premises that form the foundation of the narrative. So once you've established the themes that you want to be looking at, it becomes the starting point for everything in your screenplay. By breaking down a theme into its kind of core components, we can externalize these elements through characters and settings to create a compelling premise. That's what we were talking about before. So if you look at another example of another film, I'm sorry if you haven't seen these films because we are terribly spoiling every single one of them. But if you look at Fight Club, we have the two beliefs in conflict of conformity and rebellion. And Fight Club externalized conformity through the character, specifically emasculated, highly caffeinated white collar workers. And then on the other hand, rebellion against the status quo was externalized through setting, which was specifically a brutal underground fight club. So arriving at the premise of Fight Club may have involved the writer asking questions like, what if a man feeling trapped by the conformist expectation of society sought a way to break free? Or what if men who felt similarly suffocated by societal expectations sought a way to express their frustration? On the surface, office workers and underground fighting are two incompatible elements. And we spoke about this earlier. Incompatible, you have to have two incompatible elements to make a story. However, while it's clear that office workers are not physically or mentally equipped for one-on-one combat, their resentment and frustration lend themselves perfectly to it. So it becomes their therapy. And you see, in this instance, abstract themes can be difficult to grasp, but externalizing them through concrete elements or observable elements make them clearer and more relatable. Sorry, Chris, you carry on.
Yeah, no, no. I think on that note, I think particularly with this notion of the final considerations, I think a lot of it is going to come down to effectively building lists of the elements that you find most fascinating when it comes to themes, when it comes to what you're exploring, what you're interested in, to begin posing questions or arguments or statements, particularly thematically. I think the same works for genre. You want to look at the types of stories you're drawn to telling, and by the same reckoning concept, if you begin to fill out lists of and perhaps even index card in this particular example, themes and genres and concepts being the simplistic in its most simplistic form, a location and key characters. But if you begin placing those together and figuring out how they work, immediately what you'll find, particularly because of the theme, is that stories often unearth themselves through that thematic exploration. I think that's something Mike was mentioning a little bit earlier. This really is how to develop a strong premise, as it were, from the beginning. So if you're just using, and they can be albeit random examples, because these are ones you can develop and they can be used interchangeably. But if you're looking, for example, if you're fascinated by sci-fi films and the exploration of the dangers of technology, you instantly you have the beginnings principles of crafting that particular idea. If the notion then is, well, I prefer to focus on grounded technology because I'm not that interested in space or space for exploration, or other forms, for example, immediately what you find is you're beginning to build out an idea rooted through the exploration of a particular theme. And I think if this is why Mike and I label it here, particularly in the final considerations, that this is why we label theme first, because it is the most important factor when it comes to deciding what it is you want to write. You can have a fantastic high concept idea, but if you don't know what it is you're trying to say about it, you, as we said before, you're always going to get stuck by the third act.
I would like to interject on that though, Chris, as well, and say that I don't want to discourage any writer who maybe hasn't looked at theme before and obviously has a whole load of screenplays. You probably have subconsciously incorporated themes into your work, and it's just maybe not clear. So what can sometimes help is going through your work again, reading through it, understanding what you're trying to say, what the characters are trying to say, ultimately what the arc of the character is, what the story is trying to say to the reader, and through that, you will end up finding out kind of a rough idea of the argument or the theme that you're kind of looking at. The
Yeah,
thing is,
I mean,
it can be difficult to sometimes say to writers, okay, first come up with a theme. Okay, well, I want to write justice versus revenge, and now write a screenplay. That can be difficult because a lot of the time we have ideas, right? Ideas come to us first. I want to write about a shark attack in a beach, right? Then the themes will come after the fact. So it is possible to do it the other way around. What we're saying is that for definitely on the final consideration, do not leave it out. Because if you
yeah,
leave it out, ultimately, like Chris mentioned before, your characters will say and do things to get to the next scene, and your plot will move forward, and ultimately, it won't really have the emotional resonance that it needs to have. Uh,
yeah.
Having
I
that
mean,
thing.
I think so. So, I mean, to kind of share something that Mike and I have been working on a little bit about, this notion of the importance of theme and sustenance to particularly to your writing. And when we talk about when we really talk about storytelling, not even by its core level screenwriting, but when we talk about storytelling, we often come across, or many maybe are aware of or referred to, the Aristotle principle that stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Although obviously, for those unaware, he was talking directly about tragedies and not necessarily all stories. But if you use that example and then you fast forward, a few thousand years, I think it was Jean-Luc Godard attested that films should have all of those, but not necessarily in that order. Then you look at films like Michael Haneke's Amour, Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, or Steven Soderbergh's Traffic. They're all examples of particular films that don't adhere to that core belief, or just simply do everything they can to disprove it. The question then is, why are they still successful? And if we believe that screenplays and stories in general, in fact, rely on three simple principles, which is the ability to gain, retain, and repay, is the principle I think Mike and I now have shifted in terms of our structures and how it is we work the stories we want to tell. We believe that effectively is the core to any story, whether you're writing a feature film, a short, a TV pilot, or just simply telling a story over a campfire. You need to gain the attention of your audience in the beginning. You need to retain it for the duration of that story, and you have to repay your audience by the end of it. It is that simple. If you do not do those things, you will lose your audience. I mean, that core value constitutes a well-told story across the board. If you take any good or successful film you can think of, they have ensured that that happened. Most notably because the audience is pretty much your judge, jury, and executioner. And it's seldom, if a poor story told is often forgotten by a frustrated audience. But a great story told poorly is often remembered and actually retold. If you consider those values the most important factors when you consider writing your stories, you'll continually ask yourself, am I gaining, retaining, or repaying the audience's attention? You will, at the very minimum, ensure that you're actually connecting to your audience. That is how to tell a story efficiently. Because I think you'll find, from Mike and I at least, the recognition that when it comes to structure, you can structure a film any way you like. But when it comes to films, particularly films, and I think stories in general, if you do not gain, retain, and repay, you will find that you've lost your audience, and therefore you will not be successful. That by its very premise is the only reason we write stories is to find ourselves an audience. And if you lose your audience, you have no audience. That's the argument. So I think kind of that was something Mike and I, wanted to touch on, particularly in this class, because it's something new that we've started working on, and the importance of it. By their very bare minimum, if I'm just talking on those key principles, if I'm talking about gaining an audience's attention, and we talk about this later in one of our other classes, for those who I believe are semi-finalists and above, we talk a bit about the first 10 pages. That really is, for the most part, how you gain your audience's attention is in the first 10 pages. It is crucial. You will find a very large number, if not all, particularly studio execs, but a number of competitions, a number of financiers. They will read your first 10 pages and start making a decision on your writing ability within 10 pages. They should be the strongest part of your writing. And I say that in the you need to leave your mark, particularly at the beginning. You need to gain their attention. And if you've lost their attention within the first 10 pages, you probably lost your audience and you will not retain or repay by the end of it. And they generally will not give you the opportunity to do so. If we're talking about retaining, I think for Mike and I, again, this really touches on the elements of theme that we've talked about. The notion that there is a central argument. What is that argument? And I must be interested in it. This is why we tend to choose universal themes, because they actually afford us the opportunity to connect to that theme, or at least attempt to understand the writer's version of it.
And I
And
think as well on that point, Chris, you
yeah.
have a compelling argument. I think you have interesting characters as well. I think that's where.
But there are multiple facets. I think, yeah, for us, there are a number of what I think if you're asking the questions, how am I ensuring that I retain the audience? Particularly for the duration of the story, there are multiple facets that are included in that, and they're often down to countless elements, even simplistic things like dialogue, witty dialogue, particularly or in comedies, for example. be that developed characters, be that theme. I use theme because we've talked about it here, but for the most part, yes, there are, like Mike said, there are a number of different things. This is not to say theme is the only answer when it comes to maintaining or retaining your audience's attention. And then by the end of it, you need to repay their attention. That comes through the form of some form of resolution.
Yeah, I think that's the logical conclusion ultimately, isn't it?
Yes, and that logical conclusion again is tied often to your theme. One of my most, I think Mike and I used an example previously in a number of cases, but The Wrestler is a fantastic example of one that you repay the audience's attention by the fact that you recognize, although he's not necessarily grown as a character, which is often expected in screenwriting, that we've repaid it by the fact we accept the person that Mickey Rourke's character is. And that allows us to better understand the person that we've followed and this journey that we've gone on. If you do not repay the audience's attention, they will feel cheated, and it will scupper the opportunity to what's the word? To allow your audience to feel connected to your material.
I think The Wrestler is a great example for that as well, though, because I think that ultimately everything in the screenplay leads toward that logical conclusion at the end, where whether you feel it's a kind of a tragic ending or however you want to read into that, it makes the only possible ending you could see for that character. And I
Yeah.
think that's what we talk about when we talk about the logical conclusion, is that we're coming toward the end of the screenplay after we presented the argument and we've had all these interesting interactions, that we've got a moment at the end of the screenplay where it's what the reader expects. And that's the moment where we feel, as a reader and audience, we feel fulfilled by it.
Yeah. And then so kind of moving on, just final notes. If you haven't, please make sure I mean, we have an exhaustive reading list. I think everybody does. If you haven't, by the bare minimum, I think read The Writer's Journey, Save the Cat, Sid Field's screenplay, story, creating character. I think there was a few others that I'll probably send out a list afterwards. But I would say particularly these examples are the core for any screenwriter who's starting out. And I only say that I think Mike and I, it's funny because Mike and I, when we began writing the book, the notion really was, okay, take everything you've learned as a screenwriter, and this is often the case when it comes to any form of career. You need to learn all the core principles and then throw them out the window and start and understand yourself. And that's where we began talking about theme and the exploration of it. I don't think enough of they feel somewhat formulaic, but you need to understand the principles in order to understand how to improve upon them. So I think for us, whether it's reading these books or countless scripts, you need to read. You need to be reading, and particularly material, whether or not it's even just examples of films you enjoy or themes you want to explore further. Whether you've seen the film, I would advise reading the script once you've read it, once you've seen the film, sorry, if you haven't already. Um, as a writer, the importance cannot be understated when it comes to actually consuming that form of literary material. Um, and I think aside from that, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add, Mike.
No, I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
Probably.
But I think across the board, that was kind of the goal, really, was, I mean, hopefully everybody's found it moderately useful. If there are questions, by all means, we have a little bit of time now. I'd love to ask, to allow those, if anybody had a question they wanted to ask, or if not, as this if we put here, info@writersbywriters.com, you are more than welcome to send it through. We are moderately busy. We'll try as long as it's not a 90-page script or 120 page or whatever it is. I will try to respond as and where we can. Um, I mean, yeah, I hope, as I say, I hope the classes was useful for Mike and I. Everything is, even in our beginning, a lot of it was attending as many sessions as we could just to learn a few nuggets of truth here and there. Hopefully, everybody could take away something from this. Hopefully, perhaps even we've inspired you to write a little bit to focus more on theme, and you will be the writers to go forth and craft wonderful screenplays, and we can all stay in touch and give an opportunity to other writers based on this. But I think for us, we enjoy doing this. This is something that Mike and I set up with the goal of running on the side, really, of our own careers, just because I think in the early stages, it takes so long to really understand and find opportunities where there's value.